We're now going to move to Italy and to the Italian Renaissance. And the artist we're going to be looking at today is Michelangelo Buonarroti, or as most people know him, just Michelangelo. The artwork that we're going to look at in the most detail is his Sistine Chapel ceiling. Now, I remember some of my old students would get confused and call this the 16th chapel, as if he painted 15 other ones before this one. However, this chapel is actually named after Pope Sixtus, the person who paid Michelangelo to paint it. A pope is the head of the Catholic Church, and this was the Pope's personal chapel to pray in. So this chapel was a place of great importance in the religious world. Now, the story of how Michelangelo came to paint this chapel is an interesting one, because Michelangelo was not a painter at first. But first, let's look closer at the ceiling. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel is covered with scenes from the Bible. This particular scene is from Genesis, and it shows the creation of Adam. Let's look more closely at this scene in particular. And let's try to look at this artwork without drawing any conclusions right away. On the right-hand side, we see an old guy in a white beard. He's wearing a thin, light pink gown. Even though he's old, he looks pretty muscular. He's leaning over to touch someone with his fingertip. Over on the left-hand side, we see a young man, and he's completely naked. He's partially sitting up, and he also looks really muscular. The young man seems to be sitting on the edge of a grassy hill, but there isn't much of a background besides that. Behind the old man is a strange shape made out of pink cloth. Between the old man and the pink cloth are a bunch of chubby, naked creatures. They're looking in all kinds of different directions, but mostly towards the young man. Everything on the right seems to be floating in the air somehow. Now, let's try to break this down into clues about what this artwork is actually about. When I ask my students who the old man is, they almost always say that he's God. And at least he's the version of God that comes from Michelangelo's imagination. He looks old and wise, and the fact that he's floating in midair suggests that he's supernatural. As for the people behind him, my students usually say that they are angelic creatures like cherubs, a kind of junior angel. And now to that weirdly shaped area of pink cloth. Some people in the past have told me that this looks a little bit like the shape of a brain. I know some of this comes from the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. However, there are some people who suspect that Michelangelo did have the knowledge of human anatomy that could have come from secret late-night anatomy classes. To a certain extent, I can see where my students are coming from. That curve on the bottom looks a little bit like the medulla to me, and the leg that's sticking out reminds me of a brainstem. If this theory is true, then this means that the artwork is saying that Adam is being created directly from the mind of God. And speaking of Adam, he is the person who's on the left. But look into his eyes. There's nothing there yet. He's been created, but he's not really alive yet. He does not have a soul. The spark of life still needs to jump across from God's fingertip to the fingertip of Adam. When we put all these clues together, we see a vision that is straight out of the book of Genesis. God has already created heaven and heavenly creatures. God has created the earth, He's created the body of the first human, and God is about to give him the spark of life. But that spark has not yet jumped. This is the moment just before the creation of humanity. Now here's a mystery. Michelangelo was famous for being a sculptor. He has hardly any experience painting at all. So why did he take on something as huge as the Sistine Chapel ceiling? After all, taking on a project like this was not something for a beginner. And he painted the Sistine Chapel using a technique called fresco. Fresco's brutal. Here's how it works. You get all of your raw colored stones, and then you turn them into pigment by grinding them into a fine powder. Then you add a little bit of water until it makes a thin paste. You climb up on some scaffolding, and you put down a layer of fresh plaster on top of the ceiling. While this plaster is still wet, you use your paintbrush to paint the color into the fresh plaster before it dries. If you make a mistake, you have to chisel out the parts that you messed up and start all over again. It took Michelangelo 5 years to do this ceiling. He did have some tricks to help him though. He made all sorts of preparation drawings, just like we make rough copies to help us develop our skills and ideas. This is a sketch that Michelangelo did for the body of Adam, where he's trying to get the anatomy correct. He also made some larger drawings called cartoons. Then he punched a whole bunch of tiny holes through the outlines to transfer his drawings into the fresh plaster. He was basically using a tracing technique. Michelangelo loved anatomy, and he loved drawing muscles. Michelangelo was also really gay. He really wasn't into drawing women. Now, this is hardly true of all gay folks out there, but all of Michelangelo's women in his paintings often look like bodybuilding weightlifters with the addition of breasts and a female hairstyle. This doesn't happen with his sculpture, though. As a side note, in the 1980s, the Sistine Chapel underwent a very thorough cleaning. Years of dirt and soot from candles were scrubbed off, revealing this bright, bold color scheme underneath. This was funny because for decades, art historians had been talking about Michelangelo's masterful use of browns and elegant color mixing, but this turned out not to be the case. So to a certain extent, you can see that Michelangelo did not have a lot of comfort with painting. So why did he devote 5 years of his life to doing this? That's because of a bet. Michelangelo and another artist both wanted to rebuild the most important cathedral in the Catholic world, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. But that other artist was quite sneaky. He went to the Pope and asked a question. Do you really think Michelangelo is ready to try something besides sculpture? How about we put Michelangelo's skills and flexibility to the test? Why don't you get him to paint your personal chapel? And if he does a good job, then you will know that he has the flexibility to be able to take on designing your basilica. But if he fails, then maybe I should do it instead. That artist was intentionally trying to set Michelangelo up for failure. It was a trap. Michelangelo's determination ensured that it turned out anyway. And in the end, it was Michelangelo who got the job to design St. Peter's Basilica. And this is the interior of that basilica today. It was completed about a century after Michelangelo's death. And as famous as the Sistine Chapel is, for Michelangelo, it was just a job that he had to do in order to be able to design this. Oh, and one more thing. Now, you've all been very polite, and I know that no one is going to raise their hand and ask the question. But I know what you're all wondering. Adam's body looks like that of a full-grown man except for, well, one part. You might be wondering how come Adam's penis is so tiny. This actually goes back to history. Remember how the word Renaissance means rebirth? Europeans in the Renaissance were looking back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Back in ancient Greece, it was considered more beautiful and elegant to have a very small penis. It was fashion. When the Italians were looking back to their ancient history, they copied the ancient fashions of what was considered beautiful. Yes, it's an awkward topic, but now you know.